In this lesson, we're going to discuss digital certificates. Now, a digital certificate is a digitally signed electronic document that binds a public key with a user's identity. Now, when I talk about a user here, the user can be a real live person like you and I, or it can be a server, a workstation, or other device that is assigned a digital certificate. Now, these certificates are commonly going to use the X.509 protocol standard for digital certificates inside of PKI, and these certificates contain the owner or user's information, including things like their name, their organization, and even their public key, as well as containing all the information about the certificate authority too. Now, as we explore digital certificates, you're going to learn about wildcard certificates, single-sided and dual-sided certificates, self-signed certificates, third-party certificates, the root of trust, the certificate authority, the registration authority, the certificate signing request, the certificate revocation list, the online certificate status protocol known as OSCP, OSCP stapling, public key pinning, key escrow agents, and key recovery agents. Now, normally, when a certificate is purchased for a server, it's going to be applied to only one server by default. So, if you paid to get a digital certificate for DionTraining.com, it's not going to be able to be used for DionTraining.com, www.DionTraining.com, and courses.DionTraining.com too. But if I use a wildcard certificate, I can use it for all of those websites. So, this brings us to our first key term, a wildcard certificate. Now, a wildcard certificate is going to allow all the subdomains to use the same public key certificate and have it displayed as valid. Wildcard certificates are easy to manage, especially if all of your servers are going to be subdomains off your main web domain. Now, this is going to allow you to use one certificate, it'll allow you to save a little bit of money because you only have to buy one certificate, and it can make your life a bit easier because you only have one certificate to manage. In fact, most of my websites are going to use wildcard certificates because of the ease of maintainability. But with every advantage, there are some disadvantages you have to consider if you're going to be using a wildcard certificate. Now, the biggest one is that if your server is compromised and that certificate needs to be revoked, it's actually going to affect all of your other subdomain servers too. Luckily, reissuing a new certificate is a pretty quick process, and you only have to have one single wildcard certificate to use. This will allow you to get back online pretty quickly because you can reissue a new certificate and push it to all of your servers. But this is something you should be aware of when you're deciding whether or not to use a single-use certificate or a wildcard certificate. Now, some organizations have multiple websites that have different domain names too. For example, I personally have DionTraining.com and JasonDion.com. Now, if I wanted to use one certificate to cover both of those domains, and since they don't have the same root domain of DionTraining.com, I would have to modify what's known as the SAN field, or the subject alternate name. Now, if you adjust this subject alternate name field inside of the digital certificate, you can use this one certificate to support both of those domains instead of using a wildcard certificate. Remember, if you're using two different domains, you're going to have to use a subject alternate name field instead of using a wildcard. But if everything is on the same domain, like www.DionTraining.com and courses.DionTraining.com, then you can use a wildcard certificate. Second, we need to cover single-sided and dual-sided certificates. Now, let's say, for example, you want to connect to my website and create a secure session that's going to be established between my server, who's going to identify itself to your web browser, using my server's digital certificate. That would be considered a single-sided certificate. Now, you aren't required to have your own digital certificate to authenticate back to me. And so, because of this, we only have one side of authentication happening, and we call this a single-sided certificate. Now, some organizations require both the server and the user to validate each other using certificates. When this occurs, we call this a dual-sided certificate. Now, using dual-sided certificates is going to be better for security, but it does require twice the processing power on the server, so it's only going to be used in really high security environments. Third, we have something known as a self-signed certificate. Now, self-signed certificates are digital certificates that are signed by the same entity whose identity it's certifying, rather than by a trusted certificate authority or third party. In essence, the entity is claiming its own identity and vouches for itself. Now, these certificates can provide encryption just like other certificates, but they don't offer the same level of trust because there's no external verification of the user's identity. Now, they are commonly going to be used in things like testing environments and closed systems and non-production systems where trust is already established. But anytime you're accessing a site using one of these self-signed certificates, it will create a warning inside of your web browser, especially if you're using it on a publicly facing website because it lacks the endorsement of that trusted third party. Now, fourth, we have third-party certificates. Third-party certificates, often just called certificates, are digital certificates issued and signed by a trusted certificate authority, which we call a CA. Now, these certificate authorities will have their root certificates embedded into major web browsers and operating systems, which means that any certificate they issue is inherently going to be trusted by that system or browser. When a user or system encounters a third-party certificate, they can actually trace its authenticity back to a known and trusted CA or certificate authority. And this level of external verification will ensure a higher degree of trust and security for online transactions or encrypted communications, and this makes third-party certificates a preferred choice for any publicly facing websites or applications you may be hosting. Fifth, we have the root of trust. Now, with digital certificates, each certificate is validated using a concept known as the root of trust, or the chain of trust, that moves from the bottom all the way to the top. I like to think about this like a family tree. Let's assume your grandfather is the patriarch of your family and everybody trusts him. He then had your father, and so since everybody trusted your grandfather and your grandfather trusted your father, they're now going to trust your father too. Then your father had us. And because nobody really knows if they should trust us or not, they look up and say, well, I trusted your father, and I trusted your father's father, who's your grandfather, and because we can go back up that chain, we're going to assume that you can be trusted here as well. That's the idea. Your grandfather, in this example, is the root certificate authority because he is the highest level in this particular little family tree. The family tree is going to be known as our certification path in the world of digital certificates. Now, if I end up having a child, that child would have to go back up our family tree again and have our grandfather vouch for Junior's trustworthiness, and so on as we go down the family tree. The root of trust for most certificates is going to be a trusted third-party provider, like VeriSign, Amazon, Google, Cloudflare, or some other large service provider. Sixth, we have the certificate authority. The certificate authority is the trusted third party who's going to issue these digital certificates, and therefore, the certificate is also going to contain their name, their digital signature, the serial number for that certificate, the issue and expiration date, and the version of that certificate. To get a digital certificate for your web server, you do have to purchase that certificate from a certificate authority or registration authority, which brings us to our seventh term, the registration authority. For digital certificates to be issued, the user first has to request a digital certificate from a registration authority, which is known as an RA. The registration authority then will request the identifying information from the user and forward that certificate request up to the certificate authority, who will create the digital certificate for the user. Now, there are many root certificate authorities out there, including companies like VeriSign, DigiSign, and numerous others who can act as trusted third parties to validate the certificates are being issued to the correct people. The certificate authority also maintains a publicly accessible copy of that user's public key, and this allows them to have that for use by other users who wish to send them confidential information. So, when you want to go to our web server for diontraining.com, your web browser is actually going to our trusted third party and pulling our public key and then using that to encrypt a long random series of numbers that we can then use as a shared secret key. But since you encrypted it using the diontraining.com server's public key, only that server will be able to decrypt your message, read that random long series of numbers your system chose, and then use that to create a bulk encryption tunnel using symmetric encryption algorithms like AES with that newly chosen shared secret key. Eighth, we have the certificate signing request. A certificate signing request, known as a CSR, is a vital component in the process of obtaining your digital certificate for your server or other devices. Essentially, a certificate signing request is a block of encoded text that contains information about the entity that's requesting the certificate, including the organization's name, domain name, locality, and country. When an entity desires a digital certificate from a certificate authority, it first generates a certificate signing request, which includes the entity's public key. The certificate authority will then use the details in that certificate signing request to create the final digital certificate that will be issued back to you. It's important to note the private key associated with the request remains securely with the requester and is never sent out to the certificate authority, because this ensures the confidentiality of that given key pair. Once the certificate authority validates the entity's credentials and processes the certificate signing request, the resulting certificate will be returned to the entity and can be installed on all of its servers to facilitate secure communications. Ninth, we have the certificate revocation list, known as the CRL. Now, each certificate authority is going to maintain its own certificate revocation list, known as the CRL. This CRL will serve as an online list of digital certificates that the certificate authority has already revoked. Usually, this is because those certificates have become compromised by some kind of data breach. The certificate revocation list is the full list of every certificate that has ever been revoked by that particular certificate authority. Whenever your computer tries to connect to a new web server, it's first going to request the current public key for that digital certificate from the certificate authority. Now, the certificate authority will first check the certificate revocation list before they send you that public key or digital certificate to ensure it hasn't already been revoked. 10th, we have something known as OCSP, or the Online Certificate Status Protocol. Anytime your system needs to determine if a certificate was revoked, it's going to use this protocol known as the Online Certificate Status Protocol, or OCSP. OCSP will allow you to determine the revocation status of any single digital certificate using its serial number, and it operates as an alternative to the certificate revocation list because it operates much more quickly and efficiently because it's not using encryption and it only is looking up one digital certificate at a time. Now, this lack of encryption does make it less secure though. This brings us to the 11th thing we have, which is OCSP stapling. Now, just like OCSP was an alternative to the certificate revocation list, OCSP stapling is an alternative to OCSP. This process used to be known as the TLS Certificate Status Request Extension. Now, this OCSP stapling will allow the certificate holder to get the OCSP record from the server at regular intervals and include it as part of the SSL or TLS handshake. By doing this, it eliminates an extra connection being required at the time of the user's request, and this also speeds up the tunnel creation process to get us that secure tunnel that we're going to use to send the bulk of our data back and forth between your web browser and our web server. 12th, we have public key pinning. Now, one concern with digital certificates is that if an attacker can impersonate a server, they can really trick us. So to prevent this from occurring, public key pinning was created. Public key pinning allows an HTTPS website to resist impersonation attacks from those who are trying to present fraudulent certificates by presenting a set of trusted public keys to the user's web browser as part of its HTTP header. Now, if the web browser doesn't get the matching public key from the certificate authority, then it knows that that website was compromised and it's going to alert the user that there's an issue. 13th, we have key escrow agents. Now, key escrow is going to occur when a secure copy of a user's private key is being held, just in case the user accidentally loses their key. If your organization simply can't accept any data loss, then you need to ensure that key escrow has been set up, and you're going to do this by using a key escrow agent. Remember, whenever you use key escrow, you have to protect that key store from anybody who's trying to steal those keys, and it's recommended that you have at least 2 different administrators present anytime a key is being taken out of escrow. This is going to help you implement the concept of separation of duties as well. Now, 14th, we have key recovery agents. Now, a key recovery agent is a specialized type of software that allows the restoration of a lost or corrupted key to be performed. Think of this as a backup of all of the certificate authority's keys, just in case a major incident or disaster occurs. So remember, there is a lot going on in the world of digital certificates, and everything in the world of digital certificates comes down to trust. If a root certificate authority is compromised by an attacker, for example, then every certificate that has ever been issued by that certificate authority is now considered to be compromised, and they have to be revoked and reissued. Luckily, this is not a frequent occurrence, especially with commercially trusted third-party certificate authorities. But if you're running your own certificate authority within your organization and it gets compromised, this is something you will need to be aware of so you can revoke all of your digital certificates and then recreate new, secure digital certificates for all of your servers, workstations, and users.